Why is it that the most powerful forces in the world do not fear darkness, but tremble at something once called light? Beneath the Vatican, a fortress long regarded as the stronghold of faith and sanctity, lies a mystery never officially acknowledged. Not a tale of demons, heresy, or forbidden sorcery, but of an angel. And not just any angel. A radiant being, with wings like the first dawn and eyes that burned with sacred fire, sealed away not by myth, but by blood, stone, and silence. According to long-forgotten records, such a being was once entombed beneath St. Peter's Basilica, the beating heart of the Vatican. Not chained with iron, but bound by sacred rites, performed by the most powerful cardinals of the Renaissance. Not condemned for his sins, but for the light he brought. An angel. But why was he imprisoned? Could it be that he was not a fallen one, but an enlightener too dangerous to control? What did they fear? That his light would not obey? That the truth he revealed would unravel the structures of belief built over centuries? If an angel is a messenger of truth, why was he silenced by rites of binding? And if evil is the enemy, then why did the Vatican itself shudder at the memory of a being who once stood beside the throne of God? More than a theological enigma, this is a question that was never meant to be asked. Could what we call angel sometimes be a greater threat than the devil himself? We begin a journey to uncover a mystery that has never been explained in the Church's official history. A story buried beneath stone vaults. A truth locked away by the very faith it once served. And a being, still waiting to awaken. Part 1, Father Antonio, the keeper of books, and the one who opened forbidden doors. Father Antonio was not an exorcist. He was not the kind of man who held a crucifix in trembling hands, walking into darkness to battle demons. He was a quiet priest, young, meticulous, and nearly invisible, living among the marble corridors of the Vatican, where every wall holds a piece of history the world was never meant to see. Day after day, he worked in silence among shelves dusted with time, cataloging thousands of manuscripts, papal letters, and decrees the Church had hidden from sunlight for centuries. His task was simple: transcribe, digitize, classify. But inside the hush of the Vatican library, truth never truly sleeps. One late night, as most clergy had already retired to their prayers and only faint candlelight flickered from the stone alcoves, Antonio stumbled upon an old leather box, worn, brittle, and entirely unfamiliar. Inside it, a bundle of Renaissance-era letters, their ink fading, the wax seals crumbling like dried leaves. And there, buried within the Latin script, he found a phrase that chilled his spine. Angelus subterram, angel beneath the earth. Not Angelus as in the sacred hymns. Not the saving angels he had spoken of in sermons. But an angel, buried. Why would a celestial being dwell beneath the ground, rather than above the heavens? Why would a 16th-century cardinal write of a winged entity sealed beneath the very foundation of St. Peter's Basilica? Antonio knew well what should be avoided: letters that never made it into the official archives, references that strayed too far from doctrine, and above all, pages marked with strange symbols, broken red seals, or cryptic warnings. But true faith, he would come to learn, is not always obedience. Sometimes, it is the longing to find the light, no matter where it leads. From that moment on, he was no longer just a keeper of books. He became the bearer of a question the Church had spent centuries trying to forget. And when his footsteps echoed down the ancient corridor, into the crypt where long-dead popes lay entombed, he had no way of knowing that he was walking toward a history never taught. Not the history of mankind, but the history of beings with wings. Those who once stood beside the throne of God, and had been imprisoned ever since. Part 2, Traces buried beneath the Basilica. Not every door in the Vatican has a handle. Some are concealed by time. Others are locked by doctrine. And then there are doors. Doors that only open when someone dares to ask the questions no one was meant to ask. Antonio followed the trail: fragmented letters, cryptic instructions, symbols etched on old maps that had been mostly erased. They led him to a forgotten wall niche, tucked away behind an unused corridor. There, behind a mold-stained tapestry hanging beneath a moss-covered arch, he found a narrow crevice in the stone. There were no signs. No warnings. Only a faint emblem, two crossed wings behind a key, like a whisper from the past. If you found this place, you must also accept the cost. Antonio gently pulled the tapestry aside. Behind it was a rough stone door, its faded red cross barely visible after centuries. An ancient iron lock, rusted to the point of crumbling, disintegrated in his hand. As the last piece of metal hit the ground, a rush of cold air spilled outward. A sigh from a world that had been forgotten. He stepped inside. There was no light. No echo. Only the flicker of his candle, and the sound of his own heartbeat. The chamber revealed itself. A small, circular room carved directly into solid rock. Its walls were covered in inscriptions, Latin intertwined with ancient Greek, and a third script Antonio didn't recognize, part Kabbalistic, part something far older, as if it belonged to a language that predated language itself. At the center stood a black granite altar. No flowers. No crucifix. No signs of consecration. Only a bronze mask, oxidized green with time, resting in silence. Its angelic face serene, emotionless, eternal. Antonio bent down, carefully lifted the mask. Etched inside, in delicate Latin, were the words. Clavis abyssi. The key of the abyss. At that moment, something shifted. It wasn't wind. It wasn't an earthquake. It was a presence. His candle flickered violently, its flame twisting as if in fear. The air grew thick, dense, unmoving, as if the stone itself were holding its breath. From a corner untouched by the light, a sound rose. Not a voice, not a growl. A whisper, inside his mind. Then, it appeared. A being of radiant form, tall, wings unfurling to fill the chamber like living ribbons of blazing light. Its body shimmered, its edges blurred, as if it didn't fully belong to this world. Within the searing white gold glow, only two things were clearly visible. Its eyes, smoldering embers suspended in the void. It didn't speak aloud. But Antonio heard it. I am Serial. One of the Watchers. Sent to guide mankind at the dawn of your race. No sound, yet the words rang through his bones. No threat, but overwhelming authority. No plea, yet no regret. Serial stood there, not as a prisoner, but as living proof that history is not always written by the victors. Antonio froze. In the angel's light, he didn't feel peace. He felt something deeper. A truth too immense to deny. The being before him was not a demon. But it was not the angel he had known from sermons. And the most terrifying part was this. Antonio did not fear it. He pitied it. Part 3, Serial, Angel or Betrayer. The light emanating from Serial's form did not burn. But neither did it warm. It was not the divine light described in Scripture. But something older. Like the fading glow of a torch once lit at the dawn of humanity. Then extinguished by hands that claimed the name of justice. Antonio couldn't take his eyes off those wings. Not because they dazzled. But because they bore the subtle markings of chains once fastened. I did not rebel like Lucifer. I did not covet a throne, nor challenge the Almighty. My crime was compassion. The voice didn't come from Serial's lips. It echoed inside Antonio's mind. Every word carrying the weight of a soul speaking from beneath centuries of silence. Serial spoke of a time before words. When mankind trembled under stormy skies. Racked by illness. Wandering blind through the wilderness of a world yet unnamed. And it was the watchers like him, the guardian angels, who descended not to rule, but to offer the first light. How to keep fire alive through winter. How to use herbs to heal the wounds of flesh. How to read the rhythm of the stars and avoid famine and flood. We did not teach them rebellion. We taught them how to survive. And for that, they were condemned. Memories flooded Antonio's mind. Not in images, but in feeling. A radiant city built of light. Angels walking beside humankind, not as lords, but as teachers. Then, the decree. The purge. The cleansing. Those who had offered knowledge were branded heretics. The watchers were recast as the fallen. Some were destroyed. Others, like Serial, sealed away. They deemed us dangerous. Not because we betrayed heaven, but because we gave humanity a light that power could not control. Antonio stood in silence. If what he was hearing was true, then the scriptures he studied, the faith he served, may have been shaped not for truth, but for order. He asked, with a voice quivering between fear and longing. You could be deceiving me. You could be a devil wrapped in light, a test of faith. Serial did not argue. He only lowered his head. No anger. No appeal. Only a sorrow so ancient. It seemed to have waited lifetimes for someone to ask that question. You have every right to doubt. If knowledge is sin, then speaking to you now is yet another fall. The question was no longer, is Serial an angel or a demon? But rather, who decided those names? And to serve what purpose? Does the church truly fear the devil? Or do they fear a truth so disruptive that if known, millions might stop obeying? Antonio could not answer. Not because he lacked faith, but because, for the first time in his life, he questioned the very faith he had once served without question. Part 4, A Dialogue Between Faith and Truth. In the forgotten stone chamber, beneath the flickering of a dying candle and the silent radiance of a supernatural being, there was no longer a boundary between heaven and earth. There were only two minds. A man and an angel, facing each other not as servant and master, but as two souls both burdened by a fracture too deep to name. Serial looked at Antonio, his ember-like eyes wrapped in a silence that felt eternal. There was no hatred. No resentment. Only a question, simple, but merciless. Why must truth be imprisoned? Why are those who bring enlightenment called heretics? The word struck Antonio like a cracked bell sounding in his soul. Not because the question was new, but because he had never dared to truly ask it. Even though he had seen it echo 100 times in forbidden manuscripts. Letters he had been instructed to digitize but never believe. Antonio tried to calm the rising storm within. Because knowledge can be dangerous. Because not everyone is strong enough to face the truth. But even as he spoke them, the words felt hollow. Not born of conviction, but of habit. They were the same justifications he had preached for years. Not because he believed them, but because he had been taught to believe them. Serial didn't argue. He stepped closer. And the light around his form softened. No longer blinding. As if this angel, this being once feared by the holiest men on earth, was dimming his light not out of shame, but so the man before him would no longer flinch in fear. But listen. If the church is truly the guardian of light, why does it fear a light from another source? If truth is God's gift, then why must it be censored? Antonio couldn't answer. His mind was unraveling. Years in seminary. Vows made at the altar. Sermons about Lucifer, framed as the arrogant rebel. And now, a radiant being, who had descended to help humankind, was punished not for pride, but for mercy. Holiness, he realized, does not always stand beside truth. And truth is not always allowed to stand in the light. I didn't come to destroy your faith, Serial whispered. I came to ask, who does your faith truly belong to? To God? Or to those who speak in his name? And in that moment, Antonio understood. This was no longer a story about a fallen angel. It was a question of power. Of who holds the right to define what is light and what is darkness. The church had once burned those who believed in science, imprisoned souls who dared to see the world differently. And now, standing before him, an angel, asking for nothing but to be heard, posed the question: if I am wrong, then who, truly, is right? Antonio was no longer a priest conversing with a supernatural being. He was a man. A soul split in two, torn between the world's teaching and a truth that now burned too brightly to deny. Part 5, Breaking the Seal, When Truth Can No Longer Be Buried. Antonio was not a revolutionary. He carried no sword, nor did he ever intend to unravel the order built over 1,000 years. But there are moments when a man comes face to face with a truth so immense, so blinding, that to remain silent is to betray it. Footsteps echoed through the stone corridor, urgent, hurried. Voices grew louder. Torches flickered at the edge of the chamber's threshold. They were coming. The guards. The clergy. Those sent to protect the sacred from the very thing that once sanctified them. Antonio had no time to weigh right and wrong. There was only one feeling rising inside him. If I don't act now, this light will be extinguished forever. He looked at the bronze mask, Clavis Abyssi. The key of the abyss. It was no longer a symbol. It was a choice. Antonio lifted the mask and placed it on the black stone altar. The very same place it had once been removed from to seal away an angel. Now, it returned to its altar not as a prison lock, but as a gateway, to unseal what was never meant to be lost. The instant the mask touched the stone, a crack thundered through the chamber. Not merely a sound, but a fracture in something far older than walls. A rupture in the ancient order itself. The walls shook. The ground trembled. The air thickened. As if the very foundation of the Vatican was taking a long, desperate breath to witness what it had spent centuries trying to bury. Serial lifted his head. From his shattered wings, light surged forth. From his wrists, where sacred chains once held fast, link by link, they burst open. Not with force, but with the right to exist. The light was no longer compressed. It erupted. Not to burn, but to remind. Like a sun trapped beneath the earth for too long, finally set free. Above, the bells of St. Peter's Basilica rang. Not for prayer, but from the tremor. Cracks tore across the marble floor. The dome shuddered. Worshippers panicked. Prayers turned to screams. Candles blew out. The stained light of faith fractured into smoke and dust. In an instant, the Vatican was no longer a fortress of control, but a shattered cage. And what it once sought to contain could no longer be held. Serial stood. No weapon. No wrath. Only a blinding white aura, rising from the stone floor to the ceiling of the cavern. Like a sunrise that had been caged. Antonio collapsed, not from fear, but because no man can remain standing before a truth that refuses to be bound. I have waited centuries for this moment, Serial said, not aloud, but into the marrow of Antonio's soul. Not to seek vengeance, but to prove that light, when sealed, does not die. It waits to rise. Outside, the Vatican's highest authorities couldn't understand what was happening. Some called it a seismic event. Others whispered, judgment. Only Antonio knew. Truth does not die. It only sleeps. And when it wakes, there is nothing that can hold it back. Part 6, The Final Warning and a New Beginning. The light slowly faded. The chamber returned to darkness, as though the awakening had never occurred. No more chains breaking. No radiant glow burning through the stone. Only Antonio remained, kneeling amid the fractured chamber, gasping for breath, trembling, and alive. And Serial was gone. But before vanishing, the angel had left behind one final message. Not spoken aloud, but etched into Antonio's soul. You did not simply unbind my chains. You shook the very walls of deceit, built from fear. Antonio clutched the bronze mask, once known as Clavis Abyssi, the key of the abyss. But now, it no longer glowed. It had gone cold, silent, as if its purpose had been fulfilled. He rose slowly, exhausted. But his eyes no longer belonged to a priest. They were the eyes of a man who had looked into something the world had chosen to forget. He walked through the ruined halls, stepping over collapsed stones, weaving between shattered pillars. Each step was a question. What if Serial was only the beginning? What if other beings had also been sealed away? And what if the Vatican wasn't protecting faith, but imprisoning a memory? A memory meant for all of humanity, long denied. Then Antonio stopped. Because he felt it. A chill rising from the earth below. Not like Serial. Not light. Not sorrow. But something else. A presence. Unreleased. A whisper without voice, beginning to stir. From somewhere deeper. Darker. Awakened, because the first seal had been broken. Antonio emerged from the tomb. Just as the first rays of dawn lit the dome of St. Peter's. Above ground, chaos. Worshippers in panic. Priests praying in fear. Shattered glass falling like shards of broken faith. And Antonio, covered in dust and sweat, walked away unnoticed. No longer obedient, but now bearing the weight of knowledge. The first seal has been broken. And greater horrors are coming. He left the Vatican in silence. No arrest. No judgment. Because those in power still hadn't grasped what had truly happened. But Antonio knew. The world still believes that truth can be locked away. With stone and sacrament. What they don't know is that truth does not die. It waits. It waits for someone brave enough to open the door. And now, the door is open. Part 7, Legend or Truth Buried Alive. An angel, imprisoned in the shadows beneath the Vatican. A watcher, not cast down for pride, but for loving humanity too deeply. If such a story is true, then what exactly lies sealed beneath the very symbols of faith before which millions kneel each day? We've heard this tale from an unnamed priest. A figure unrecorded in the Church's official history. A name absent from any sanctioned registry. A man who, if still alive, has surely been erased. But traces cannot be fully erased. A crack on the marble floor of the Basilica. A forgotten hymn in the archives. A letter from the 16th century, marked with the phrase, Angelus Subterram. Angel beneath the earth. And so the question returns. If nothing exists beneath that sacred ground, why seal it away? Why invoke holy rites, sacred relics, and fear masquerading as faith? Perhaps what the Vatican feared most was not a being with wings, but the possibility that humanity might witness a light they can no longer control. Truth, if it ever lived, was once chained. But what chain can bind an angel? When the hearts of men begin to long for questions, more than the answers they've been handed. We live in a time where myth is being redefined. Not as folklore, but as warning. A reminder that what was buried for a reason. And sometimes, that reason had nothing to do with holiness, but everything to do with preserving the illusion of certainty. For a faith too afraid to face what it cannot tame. This story doesn't end with a period. It ends with a door left open. For you, the one listening, to ask. How many secrets were labeled heresy? How many truths were condemned as betrayal? And how many lights were locked beneath marble thrones? In those days men will seek death but will not find it. They will long to die, but death will elude them. Revelation 9 verse 6. Unsolved mystery is not over. It has only just begun.